Hello everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today for our launch of Checkpoint Anti-Ransomware. We're going to be talking about the product. I'm going to be introducing it. During the session, feel free to ask us questions. You have a Q&A icon on the black bar. Hit it and you can ask us questions. We'll be answering them through the text during the message, and at the end of the session we'll also devote some time to select a few of the questions that we feel warrant a wider response and discuss them verbally. So we have here this evening here in Tel Aviv, but for many of you it is morning or afternoon, myself, Eitan Siegel, and my colleague Yossi Chasson from Checkpoint Product Management. And with no further ado, let's begin. So I'm going to start actually with a few headlines from last week. Note that these are stories from 1 week, and I could actually probably create a slide like this every week, which would be a different bunch of stories that hit the headlines on that week. So what did we happen to come up with last week? Ransomware found in Dutch Parliament, and Skype users hit by ransomware through in-app malicious ads. We also had Senate Democrats still recovering from computer ransomware attack, and Urology Austin ransomware attack may have exposed more than 279,000 patient records. All of that in the course of 1 week. And yes, we're still seeing them coming this week. Here's one from yesterday. Ransomware hits a pediatric group affecting 55,000 patients' data. This one was in Texas just yesterday. Now, these are stories that happen to hit the news and get some coverage. Obviously, this is the tip of the iceberg. So how big is that iceberg, the part that we don't see? Here are a few stats, and the numbers are pretty staggering. The FBI estimates that $1 billion were paid last year in ransom to ransomware attackers. Checkpoint's researchers have been tracking ransomware on an ongoing basis for the past more than a year, and what they saw in the second half of 2016 is that the volume of ransomware grew twofold. It doubled in the second half, and we have every reason to believe it's continuing to grow. And we have many different surveys that look at how many businesses are affected by ransomware, and the numbers vary. Between 36 to 60% and 70% I've seen in some surveys. I've got to tell you, my own unscientific belief is that it's much higher. Virtually any customer I talk to has been affected by ransomware in the past year. It feels far more like 80 or 90% from my subjective experience. So we're going to talk a little bit about ransomware attacks before we talk about how to solve them. And I'm going to start by actually an analogy to crime in the real world. So if you think about this guy, the common thief sneaks in quietly to a home or a business, steals the valuables, cleans the traces, and then he's tasked with a pretty complicated task to somehow manage to sell somebody else's stolen goods, to find a buyer who wants to buy those goods. And that can be pretty tricky. And just think of yourselves with a bunch of stolen goods, trying to find a buyer for them and not getting exposed and not getting caught in that process. Not so simple. There's another type of criminal we all know very well, the extortionist. The extortionist starts out pretty much like the common thief. He'll also sneak in quietly, but the rest of his actions take a completely different strategic approach. What he does is take property, sometimes people, as hostage, and he communicates back to the victim, to the owner of those goods or valuables, and demands ransomware for the return. And if you think of it, getting payment from the owner of the goods is actually a very good strategy, because it's pretty much guaranteed that the owner of the goods is the one person in the world, or the one entity in the world that's proven to actually want and need those goods. So that's real world crime. Now let's look at this extortionist for a little longer. One of the things that are notorious for kidnappers and extortionists are these ransom notes, right? We all have these pictures, we know them from Hollywood. I want $5 million in unmarked bills coming in paper cuttings, newspaper cuttings. But look at that. What's those unmarked bills he's asking for? There's an equivalent to that in the digital world. It's called Bitcoin. And actually, Bitcoin is fundamental when we talk about ransomware, because until the appearance of Bitcoin, you couldn't ask for the equivalent of unmarked bills, and untraceability of that transaction is actually important. So going from the real world analogy further into the cyber crime world, the topic of our discussion today. Until a few years ago, we were looking mainly at data breaches. One of the primary motivations for all cyber crimes was to get data, and after that data was breached, the cyber criminals were tasked to monetize that data, to convert it into money. And there, the risk can be pretty high. If I've managed to steal medical records, or even credit card information, or intellectual property, how do I convert that data into money without getting exposed, without getting caught? Who's going to buy that for me? Those are not simple tasks for a cyber criminal. And ransomware has taken the second approach, the approach of the extortionist. The idea is to sell the data not to some arbitrary buyer, but rather to go back to the data's owner, the one owner who's guaranteed to actually want and need that data. And it's easy money, and the risk is low. And because we have this wonderful little piece of technology called Bitcoin, suddenly ransomware became possible. Because before that, criminals couldn't really go back to a victim and ask them to pay. There wasn't really a simple way to make a financial transaction in the digital cyber world. But Bitcoin lets them do that. They lets them remain completely anonymous and make that financial transaction. So what happened next? Ransomware came to the world, fueled by Bitcoin, and it started off actually targeting individuals, regular people. But at some point, what the criminals realized is that there is much more money for them if they start targeting their attacks at businesses. Why? The reasons are pretty obvious. If we're an individual, if somebody gets my data at home and encrypts, I don't know, my pictures or some of my files, I can probably survive without them. There is a limited amount of cash I'm going to be ready to pay. And to be frank, most individuals will find starting to create a Bitcoin wallet and making that transaction and interacting with a criminal pretty intimidating, and they're not very happy and not very comfortable doing that. Sometimes they can't really figure it out technically. On the other hand, businesses completely depend on data. It's 2017, guys. We all know how much each of our businesses depends on our data. Businesses obviously have deeper pockets than individuals, and definitely have no obstacles in overcoming any technicalities of a Bitcoin transaction. And you can see the numbers here, and the numbers are very impressive. These two numbers in the two red circles are coming from a research performed recently by an IBM research group called the X-Force. 56% of businesses paid more than $10,000, and 20% paid more than $40,000. So there's a lot of money to get for these businesses. The only problem is that to get an attack through into a business is usually much harder than to infect an individual. Businesses tend to be more protected. And we've seen ransomware move to maximize their impact on businesses, being more sophisticated, looking for more evasion techniques to get in, more ingenious social engineering tricks, and then when they do get in, not just encrypting that one PC they hit, but actually moving to encrypt the file shares where all the business data is kept on the file servers, deleting backups to prevent backup as a mitigation to a ransomware attack, and spreading laterally, so not just impacting one PC, but actually impacting all the PCs on the network. So all of these new tools, new capabilities ransomware has rapidly adopted in the past year have moved them to go and target businesses more and more, and with increasingly devastating effects. We've seen ransomware take down hospitals. We've seen ransomware stop the municipal transit in San Francisco. We've seen ransomware even take down a power station. There's numerous ways they can disrupt business and ask for ransom. So let's talk a little bit more about how ransomware actually gets in to an organization. There are several attack vectors. The first one is a very, very common thing that all of us do. Browse the internet. And in every business, in every network, users are browsing the internet. And when we browse the internet, two things can happen. First of all, we could conceivably download a malicious file and click it and open it. And secondly, we could be browsing an infected website. I'm sure many of you may have heard of exploit kits or of malvertising campaigns. Those are all platforms and tactics to infect users who browse the web. Secondly, ransomware can come in through email. And that's a very good proactive approach for attackers to actually approach a user and start socially engineering them, try to trick them, either by sending a mail with a link, and then you're back to the web browsing scenario we covered earlier, or sending a mail with an attachment, and it's a malicious attachment. And again, there's a whole world of ingenious social engineering tricks to get even suspecting users to click through on some of these attacks. Some of them look amazingly genuine. Another way, which is less common, but we also see it sometimes, is a ransomware that comes in through some external media, through a USB stick perhaps, or a different form of external storage, bypassing the network perimeter completely and going directly at the endpoint. A different class completely of attacks goes after servers, and we've seen some of these ransomware attacks actually attacking websites with vulnerabilities. Some of them were running things like WordPress, which wasn't fully patched or anything like that. And then they encrypt the website data. And the website's down. And then you need to pay ransom to get your website back. Now, by the way, most of these attack vectors are not really unique to ransomware. So attackers are using them for malware in general. And ransomware is just, picked up on all of these tricks and continuing to use them, perfect them, find new evasions techniques. But these are the primary ways that malware and ransomware will get into an organization. Now, there are indeed a few steps that are conventionally used as a kind of best practice in order to prevent ransomware attacks. First of all, education, and I spoke about social engineering before. If we educate our users about some of these tricks, we can definitely decrease the attack surface, reduce the number of infections, but again, you can't depend on the human factor to be your true defense against such a big industry like ransomware attacks. The second element is backups, and most businesses indeed back up their systems. Backing up should let you retrieve the data if it's encrypted. Should, but not necessarily. Why? Well, first of all, just sit for a moment and imagine that you have the best backup system in the world. And now just consider that you have a really bad ransomware strain that's gone around and encrypted and moved laterally and encrypted all of your PCs and all of your servers. How long is it going to take you to recover that from your backup? And how current is your backup going to be? It's going to be a pretty long and painful process and very strenuous and stressful. We unfortunately also see backups fail quite often when you need them the most. And as I told you earlier, we're also seeing ransomware taking matters into their own hands and attempting to find the backups, to find the cloud storage, to find any form of storage the organization is using and move to encrypt or delete them as well. Okay, so what about antivirus? All businesses, virtually all consumers as well, use antivirus software. It's a very good thing. And we should all, by the way, continue to use antivirus. At least that's my opinion. But antivirus will only get you so far. All of these stories we hear about ransomware infections, all of these news stories that I started up with are all coming from companies who are using antivirus. And unfortunately, in this day and age, malware and ransomware have perfected techniques that can all too often bypass antivirus. So antivirus will be very good at catching existing variants of known or variants of known ransomware, but they will do little good to detect and prevent completely new strains or evasive attacks. So all of these best practice conventional measures are important and indeed are used very often, but clearly not enough. And as an illustration of that, I'm going to take you back to one of those headlines we started off with. Remember a ransomware attack that locked a Democratic state senator out of their computers? That was actually not last week. That was actually on the 8th of March. What happened last week, on the 27th of March, almost 3 weeks later, was that they have still not recovered. Think about that for a moment. 3 weeks later, and they still say things like some personal and some provided. They're talking about a combination of cells and laptops that they need to use to operate. And this one's really interesting. The Senate minority leader said Microsoft technicians would begin going around to strip down and rebuild every computer with the goal of having everything restored in the next several days. That's 3 weeks later. They need to go down and strip each PC one after the other. Now, I'm sure, by the way, that these senators were using a lot of those best practice methods. So we want to do something that goes beyond that. And we can. And with that, I'm very glad to introduce Checkpoint Anti-Ransomware, our solution, which is part of SandBlast family, for defeating cyber extortion. And ransomware is ultimately a form of extortion. So, what is our Checkpoint Anti-Ransomware? Checkpoint Anti-Ransomware is a product or a technology that lets us protect businesses from ransomware attacks, obviously. And when we built it, there were three main principles and guidelines we had in mind. First was to make a purpose-built technology. We didn't want to build just to rebrand our generic advanced threat capability as anti-ransomware, which is what some of the vendors are doing, but actually what we did was examine very closely by our malware analysts tens of thousands of malware samples, learning and understanding deeply the intricacies of how these beasts operate. and building a set of technologies, and we'll talk about what those technologies are soon, to protect endpoints, and this is an endpoint technology, from ransomware attack. The second and important guideline for the technology is for it to be future-proof. We don't want something that, like a traditional antivirus, will be highly dependent on a continuous stream of updated intelligence and signatures. And that's forced us to take a different approach to how we can actually figure out that there's a ransomware attack, one that we've never seen before. Actually figure out what's going on, and finally, if we do see that, and if some data has been encrypted, the most important thing is to keep data safe. So if any data was impacted during the attack, how do we create a safe and simple way to recover that data without going into all of those scenarios we saw in the previous slide when I showed you what the Democratic senators were having to deal with for 3 weeks. Now, soon we're going to go and talk about, I'm going to be talking about the technology, but before we'll talk about the technology inside anti-ransomware, I'm going to hand over to Yossi, who's going to show us a live demo of anti-ransomware, live ransomware infections, and how anti-ransomware can grab them. So Yossi, over to you.
Thank you very much, Eitan. So let me share my screen and start the demonstration. So I will guide you through a short demonstration of anti-ransomware. We'll see two different endpoints. We'll see Bob's PC, which is unprotected. We'll also see Pamela's PC, which is protected with Check Point's anti-ransomware technology. That's the icon that you see here in the bottom right corner, running SandBlast Agent with anti-ransomware technology. So let's start with Bob, which is running an unprotected PC. So you see Bob's precious files. He has a lot of pictures, documents, Excel files, etc. And Bob recently got, through an email, a file which he thought to be a PDF called bob-cv.pdf. In fact, this PDF is not even a PDF. If you look at its properties, we see that it's actually an executable file. It's a shortcut to an executable file, what we have here on the desktop, that has a name of a PDF file and also an icon of a PDF file. So it's disguised to be a PDF, but once we'll double click it, we'll find out in a few seconds that it will start and encrypt all of Bob's files on his My Files folder. That's actually a Cerber ransomware that was very popular a few months ago. Here you go. All the files in the My Files folder were encrypted. And in a few more seconds, the background will also be changed to a ransom note. It will take a few more seconds and we'll also see that. So actually the ransomware is going over all of the file in Bob's PC, looking for whatever file it can encrypt. And after the encryption process is done, it's feeling very comfortable to replace the background and ask for the ransom. So here it goes. Cerber ransomware, your document, photos, database, and other important files has been encrypted. And another instructions on how to pay and get a decryption key to decrypt your files back. So none of us would want to get to this unfortunate situation. So Pamela was wise enough to actually use the anti-ransomware technology. And Pamela also has some files in her My Files folder, and she will run the same ransomware, the same file. So let's run the ransomware on Pamela's PC. And in this case, we will see that after a few seconds, some of the files will actually also get encrypted, but the anti-ransomware technology will very quickly detect that a ransomware is running on the machine and will remediate it. So here you go. That's a kind of a very sophisticated ransomware. He started encrypting our files, but very quickly we got the pop-up saying that the ransomware was detected. The anti-ransomware technology is currently analyzing the infection. It's actually checking all of the processes of the attack, and after a few more seconds, the infection was quarantined. All the different processes that were part of the infection were cleaned and stopped. This is the stage where we, the user, are asked what we want to do with those files that were encrypted. So we got a list of 47 files here that we saw that were encrypted during the ransomware process before we managed to detect and quarantine it. So, and all of those files are actually been snapshotted by anti-ransomware technology, and we can restore them. So once we decide that we want to restore those files, we go to the next stage, and let's look quickly at this edit button here. Using this edit button, we can decide where we want to restore those files to, either to the original location or to another location in the hard drive. And we can decide if we want to delete the encrypted files or keep them as they are. For this demonstration, we'll keep the default configuration, which is restoring the files to the original location and deleting the encrypted files. By the way, this process could also be automated. Depends on the decision of the admin of the system. You can just automate the process and do not ask the user at all to where he wants the files to be restored, and do automatic restoration immediately after encryption is happening. So let's start restoring. And in a few seconds, we'll see all of the files coming back to the folder, the original files, and all of the encrypted files are quarantined and deleted. Let's have a look again at the list of the files that were restored. So we see that all of those 47 files were restored back to their original locations, and the status is green V mark. All of them restored successfully. So that was actually an example of untypical situation where we are able to detect the ransomware infection only after it starts to encrypt a few files. In most of the cases, we'll be able to detect the infection before the encryption starts. And now we'll see a demonstration of that. dancv.pdf is another ransomware attack. Let's click it. It is a kind of ransomware called GoldenEye. It's a kind of ransomware that comes usually through CV files and attacking usually HR departments. And this kind of ransomware we're able to detect even before the encryption process starts. In a few seconds, you'll see the notification from SandBlast agent coming up saying that ransomware detected. The files are intact. You can see them in the folder, and the ransomware was prevented. In this case, your files are intact and no action is necessary. One important thing to explain, although you see the links here to the shortcuts to both PDFs, if I'll try to run them again, I'll see that they are gone. The real file that is actually behind this shortcut is gone. It was actually deleted and quarantined by anti-ransomware. So that's all with the demo. Eitan, back to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Yossi. And let's move back to the presentation. So, a quick recap of what we saw in this demo. We saw, in fact, anti-ransomware in action, detecting a real ransomware attack in stage 1. Then we saw it moving to analyze and quarantine it. And I'll explain in a few moments what the analysis actually performs in order to be able to quarantine it. And thirdly, we saw the restoration, the point in which if some of the files were encrypted, we were able, with a couple of clicks, to restore them for the user automatically. So let's talk a bit about the technology behind anti-ransomware. First, Stage one, detection. We have developed two primary detection engines specifically for ransomware. The first one is a form of behavioral analysis that has been tuned specifically for ransomware behaviors. From all of the analysis we've done to all of those ransomware samples that we've been examining, and we have a vast access to samples through our threat emulation and sandblast network, over the past months, we've actually found and mapped algorithms that can identify a combination of generic malicious behaviors and of specific behaviors that we see just in ransomware. Behaviors like deleting backups or shadow copies or even planting a ransom note. So that's the purpose-built behavioral engine that we built for ransomware. And very often, the heuristics and algorithms in this part are strong enough to identify the ransomware before any encryption actually begins. And we saw that in the second example that Yossi showed. There's a second layer of detection, which detects the encryption activity itself. What we're doing is we're constantly tracking changes to files, to data files. We're looking what's changing those files. What's the nature of the change? Is it just one isolated change, or can we identify systematic and illegitimate change? And what we've done is tuned here another set of algorithms that can very well and very quickly distinguish what is a regular user modifying, changing, or even encrypting his own files to something that is illegitimately starting to go over files and encrypting them. And this is the last line of defense, where even if anything in the behavioral managed to bypass the behavioral detections, we will always pick up that this attack is actually going after the files and encrypting or deleting them. And either of these two engines or a combination of both can lead to a detection, and that's the second stage of the product. And once we detect it, what we do is run a forensic analysis. Now, those of you who may know Sandblast Agent, our endpoint product that's part of Sandblast, might know our very advanced forensics or automated forensic analysis that's part of that product. What it does is actually goes and analyzes forensically all the elements of the attack, giving us an ability to isolate and quarantine not just the process that was encrypting the files, but in fact the entire chain of the attack, all the different elements that are forensically identified to be associated with this attack. That's a very, very advanced capability, the ability to actually quarantine completely an attack, which we've never seen before. So again, stage one, we identify the attack, and stage two, we analyze and quarantine it. But what if some of the data did get encrypted before we completed the analysis and quarantining of the ransomware? As we saw in the first example, what we do here is we need an ability to restore those files. And to facilitate that, we've built an ongoing data snapshot capability. What that means is that before we let a file be changed, we'll take a snapshot of that file. Now, it's not 100% of changes of files. We look very carefully at what's about to change a file, which process is changing it. Is that process supposed to be changing that file? And if we're not sure if it's good or bad, but we don't want to block things because we don't yet know if it's a ransomware, we will take a snapshot of that file before we grant permission for the file change to take place. So it's a just-in-time file snapshot capability. And this just-in-time capability isn't really a backup system. We don't attempt to back up all your data in case your disk breaks down. No. What we're interested is having just enough data, a short window backwards of data, until we can determine whether those changes that were done were legitimate or illegitimate. And usually we just need a few minutes of history of data until we know the answer. And if the change was legitimate, then we can discard those files. If the change was illegitimate, then we remove the malware very, very quickly. And then we have that short history of files, which is letting us bridge the gap and actually restore the data for the user. Now, by default, we use just 1 GB of storage. The storage is on the endpoint itself, on the user's PC or on the server that we're protecting. And we protect that storage with our kernel driver to prevent ransomware from tampering with it. And it's very, very lightweight. We don't really usually need more than 1 GB, even though this is configurable, because we actually, as I explained earlier, need just a very short window of data backwards in order to assure data restoration in the case of a real infection. So it's a cyclic data snapshot capability. So just to summarize the flow of how anti-ransomware works, we have the ransomware delivered to the victim and starts infecting the computer. At this point, our behavioral analysis can kick in, identify the infection, and remove the ransomware before it has encrypted any files. Sometimes, occasionally, the ransomware might get past this layer and start encrypting files. Here we have the second layer of detection that will detect the encryption activity and block the ransomware at that stage. And in this case, the data backups or data snapshots we've been taking allow us to restore the data for the user, as we saw in the demo earlier on. So this is a kind of timeline of the different options and how the product works. Okay, so I've spent the last 5 minutes or so discussing technology, but technology is interesting, but it doesn't really answer the question, how effective is this technology? And that's really the bottom line. That's the thing that we should all care about. And the way we've decided to actually test ourselves is that we started off about 6 months ago when this technology started to mature. We built an automated process within our malware lab that goes every day out to VirusTotal and grabs all the new ransomware variants that were uploaded to VirusTotal. So those are known ransomware variants, and we automatically test them to see which ones are really ransomware that start encrypting, and those that don't, we discard. And we ended up on average, about 200 samples a day in our lab. And what we did was, after validating them, they go automatically into a different portion of the lab that's protected by SandBlast Agent, but they're protected only by the anti-ransomware technology. There's no AV signatures. In fact, the environment is completely offline. So they are known ransomware samples, but they are completely unknown to the code that's supposed to detect and quarantine them. So they're completely new. And after running this for 6 months, we're very, very happy to be at an extremely high detection rate. Again, we're taking samples, the worst samples that we can find in the wild, a very, very wide range. 99.3 is a very high number. I'll show you some numbers we've seen later on from other vendors. So that's in terms of effectiveness, and that's ultimately what we're concerned about. And this lab continues to run. We're continuing to sharpen the heuristics, the algorithms, adding more capabilities into the system, and hopefully we'll get this percentile even higher. So that's anti-ransomware, but I want now to zoom out a little bit and talk about a wider defense strategy. and talk about Checkpoint Sandblast. Checkpoint Sandblast is our solution for advanced threat prevention. It's an overall solution that will help prevent all the different infection vectors that we discussed earlier. So I talked about downloading malicious documents and browsing infected websites and malicious links and malicious attachments and malicious files coming into USB and even attacks on servers. And to actually defend from these, a good strategy, a good defense strategy doesn't just rely on a final line of defense on the endpoint. What we would like to do is to have a multi-layer defense that can actually prevent most of these attacks from even hitting the endpoint. And this will give you a much stronger overall protection. So what's in Sandblast? Sandblast is a set of technologies. We have the threat emulation sandbox, a very advanced sandbox. We have threat extraction, zero phishing, and forensics. And I'm not going to discuss each of these. It's beyond the scope of this session. And anti-ransomware is actually being added as a new technology to this family of advanced threat prevention technologies. And from a network protection perspective, these technologies come on top of our baseline prevention technologies, the IPS, the antivirus, and the antibot, which are also extremely effective in preventing all forms of attacks, and specifically also ransomware attacks. We're very proud on about the success of Sandblast. In the past year, we've seen tremendous traction with this technology with our customers. Many thousands of customers, very well received by the industry. You can see NSS Lab, Forrester, SC Awards, Network Computing, all giving it very, very high ratings. And when we look again at an organization that is tasked with providing an in-depth defense, a multi-layered defense for all of their infrastructure, from advanced threats, from all forms of threats, and ransomware being one of them, you can see how all of these technologies fit together. And each one of them, we can demonstrate how it can block some of these different attack vectors that we mentioned earlier. So Sandblast and Checkpoint Threat Prevention in general is architected to provide you with a complete layer of ransomware protection, and indeed a complete layer of advanced threat protection. Okay, so one quick slide on competitive. I showed the leftmost column earlier, the 99.3%, and I explained the methodology we're using. Keeping our own environment without any signatures, completely offline, and bringing many new samples in every day. Now, we took 150 of those samples, just arbitrary samples. We didn't cherry pick them, and we ran them through, 6 additional vendors. Some of these vendors are kind of die-hard EDR vendors that talk all day about their ransomware technologies. Some of these are network security vendors that are our traditional competitors that have also an endpoint solution. All of them talk about how they protect against ransomware. And we put them to the same test exactly. We fired them up in our lab. We kept them offline so they couldn't get any signatures to simulate a situation of an unknown ransomware, even though we were bringing samples that were known. We don't have access to unknown samples. And you can see that none of those solutions got even remotely close to the 99.3% that Checkpoint has achieved. A couple of quotes from customers who have been using this technology, early adopters. Russell Walker, Chief Technology Officer for Mississippi Secretary of State. The anti-ransomware blade is an amazing piece of technology. Not only does it protect you from ransomware, but it doesn't rely on signatures to do it. That means even if you lose your internet connection, you're still protected from unknown variants. And Starkey, Joe Hammond, the IT manager of the network services, Starkey's manufacture hearing aids. They're being a big customer for Sandblast Agent, running technology for well over a year. He says, since we deployed Sandblast Agent, we have not had a single ransomware incident in almost a year. Now, I've mentioned Sandblast Agent, and I want to explain in a few words how anti-ransomware is part of Sandblast Agent, and more generically, how you can get anti-ransomware. So there's in fact three options. The most comprehensive option is through Check Point's complete endpoint protection suite. That's our full endpoint client that includes everything from a firewall and VPN, a full disk encryption, media encryption, obviously antivirus, all the advanced threat prevention technologies of SandBlast Agent, and anti-ransomware is being added to that product. So customers who are already customers of Check Point Endpoint Protection, when they upgrade, they get anti-ransomware as a new capability free of charge. SandBlast Agent is a subset of the Endpoint Complete package. It delivers or focuses just on the advanced threats, advanced threat technologies. It's designed to be installed alongside third-party security suites, like, for instance, Symantec or McAfee, and provide additional layers of forensic analysis, threat emulation, threat extraction, so really advanced capabilities for detecting threats that could bypass traditional endpoint security. And like with the complete suite, anti-ransomware is also added to the SandBlast Agent, so it's a simple matter of those customers upgrading. Finally, we're also adding SandBlast Agent, going to provide SandBlast Anti-Ransomware as its own product, a point product that customers who are concerned about this particular threat, and it is definitely a very imminent threat that is impacting many of our customers, if they want nothing else but just the best technology to combat the risk of ransomware, the threat of ransomware, then we're going to also provide this as a dedicated product, which should be available sometime in a few weeks. So for the two left columns here, the Endpoint Complete SandBlast Agent, these are products that are already out, and anti-ransomware is part of them. The pricing remains unchanged. We will provide or publish the pricing for the SandBlast Agent dedicated anti-ransomware product when the product is released within a few weeks. So to quickly summarize, we saw today and discussed Check Point anti-ransomware. We've shown you how we can help you defeat this cyber extortion. We looked at the demo, we discussed the technology, we discussed the effectiveness. And with that, I'm going to hand over back to Yossi, and we're going to take a few questions from you guys. And we also have Pasha, R&D manager, joining us to help us answer some of those questions. So over to you, Yossi.
Thank you very much, Eitan. So I will go over a few of the questions that were asked more often during the session, and we'll try to give some answers and relate to them. And Pasha, I'll be happy to have your help on that. So a question that was asked often is around terminal server or VDI support. Do we support it, and how?
So right now we don't officially support the VDI environments. However, it is very much on the immediate roadmap, so stay tuned and you'll hear more about this relatively shortly.
Great. So next question is about an interesting one from JC Peralta around when we detect the ransomware and remove it. Does it only respond to anomalies such as detections in the number of files that are being encrypted? How do we remove only the ransomware or all of the incident tree around it?
So well before the anti-ransomware blade came into existence, we've had a forensics blade for the last 2 years. And basically what we do there is we build complete incident models based on when an attack or something triggers, some security event happens, and we build the incident model. So when anti-ransomware, the ransomware product detects something, it triggers forensics. And forensics builds this precise model which identifies all the elements of the attack. This might mean good processes doing bad things. This might be unknown or malicious processes. And by building these specific elements, we're able to even identify the exact files that were modified by the attack and thereby be able to restore them. So yes, we are doing a full remediation of the attack. And you can, depending on how you set your policy, you can quarantine, delete, and then based on the attack, we're then able to, so we will not, another question asked about snapshots. We are not going to restore everything on the system. That's the beauty of forensics. So if we detected the attack as 5 files were being encrypted, for example, we would only restore those files. We would not restore everything we may have backed up because we know from forensics exactly what was encrypted.
Just to add to what Pasha said, those of you who are interested to see a bit more about how the forensics capabilities of Sandblast Agent work, Google checkpoint Sandblast Forensics or Sandblast Agent Forensics, and look for a YouTube video that will walk you through how that technology works. And I think you'll be able to educate yourselves very quickly. We also have a number of blog posts that illustrate that. So you can very easily educate yourselves a bit about the capabilities of that technology and the elements that Pasha has been discussing.
Yeah, just to add to what Eitan just said, besides the video, there are blog posts with full interactive forensics reports within Checkpoint's blog site. You just have to type forensics and ransomware, and you should get a whole bunch of like 4 or 5 blog posts with interactive forensics reports that you can browse through, so you can expect the technology that sort of powers the whole restoration, remediation of the anti-ransomware product.
Thanks, Pasha. We saw many questions around the snapshots themselves, where they are stored, what is the limit of the size, etc. Let's relate a bit to that.
Okay, so we are not using Windows snapshots. We have our own customized backup tool, and this directly relates to performance as well. So we will not, for example, make a backup of a Word document that is being edited by Microsoft Word. We will not make a backup of a Word document that was just downloaded from the internet through your browser or your mail client. Right? We are able to understand, that a document exists and that whether it's created or it's being changed. We're able to, again, our forensics is able to make that distinction. So we only make a change, we only back up a file if we're seeing a process that is not associated with that file, making modifications to a known existing file. So the number of actual backups that happen in a regular system are minimal, right? And in fact, the vast majority of systems will never have a backup because they're not being hit by ransomware. But when ransomware executes, there's no, as far as I'm aware, and I've been studying ransomware for quite a while, there's no ransomware that actually uses MS Word to do the actual encryption itself, for example, right? And even if it did use MS Word to do the encryption, and when it was trying to encrypt JPEGs and databases, etc., that would also be very, very weird. So we're able to identify at that point which files we should back up, and based on that, we can then make targeted restorations. Secondly, in terms of size, it's stored locally on disk within our self-protected area within the disk. It's by default 1 gigabyte. But when we notice that a whole bunch of files are being sent because some application that we are not sure about is making major changes to existing files, then we will automatically expand the backup until Anti-Ransomware can make a decision on whether the attack is real or not. But I need to stress, in quite a lot of cases, we're actually going to stop the attack before it even starts encrypting, so the backup won't even come into play at that point.
Thanks, Pasha. Another interesting question was around if anti-ransomware is definition-based or not. So go ahead and take it also.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Pasha, take it also.
Okay. So anti-ransomware is completely behavioral. There are no signatures there that we're reliant on. You can turn off the machine, disconnect it from the internet, right? And you can plug in a USB with the latest ransomware samples and sort of run it through there. It should catch them all. We're basically, as Eitan mentioned earlier, our engine is running nicely across hundreds of new samples that we're downloading from VirusTotal, samples that we're getting from prominent malware researchers, and we run it through. We make sure that, and at the end of each day, we're getting the results back to understand if there are any gaps or within our product. And right now, there don't seem to be, not in terms of actually detecting the ransomware.
Great. And I think the last question that we saw coming back many times around how can we protect file shares?
Right. So right now, we are not automatically backing up network shares. So wait, there are two components. For Windows Server 2008 release candidate 2 and above, if the file share is based on that, or on traditional Windows operating system 7 and above, then you can install the anti-ransomware on the file share itself, and you'll be protected. However, if it's, for example, the file share is Linux-based or something else, in which case we are immediately on our immediate roadmap for our next major release is to give the ability to automatically back up the file shares as well if we are not sure that an attack may be occurring.
Thanks, Pasha. I'm just looking at the last open questions to see if there is anything that we didn't answer that needs to be answered. So, Tom, I think we answered questions about VDI in general, and Xen observers are some of them. Carbera is asking if ransomware are able to encrypt files on shared drives. We just covered that. Christopher Morales asks how to work with virtual platforms. So I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to, but the demonstration that you saw was running on a virtual machine. So maybe, Pasha, you have anything to add to that?
No, I think he's talking about VDIs, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay, so if it's VDI, it's the same answer that we gave already. And do we have any financial guarantee to the end user if ransomware evades anti-ransomware and encrypt files? So, no. And would this be installed on servers? So we talked about it. To the Windows Server 2008 release candidate 2 and app is supported by SBA. Okay, so I think we covered all questions. We want to thank you for attending this session about anti-ransomware. The recording of this session will be available early next week. Will be sent to all registrants and will be on the ransomware landing page. I want to thank Eitan, Pasha, and Kaushal for helping us in this session and taking answers. Kaushal, back to you.
Thank you very much, Yossi, and thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.